Hello, this time on Sitrep, the head of NATO issues his starkest warning yet about Russia's readiness for war. In Ukraine, drone warfare is reaching ever more sophisticated levels. We look at how this single weapon is changing warfare. And the Royal Navy's carrier strike group makes its way through the Red Sea. What next for this projection of UK military power?
Sitrep with Simon Newton.
Hello, thanks for joining me. Both Kate Jabot and Mike Clark are away this week, so I'm sitting in for them for this edition of Sitrep. The Secretary-General of NATO has been in the UK and issued some stark warnings about the threat posed by Vladimir Putin. Mark Rutte says Russia could be ready for war with NATO within 5 years.
Putin's war machine is speeding up, not slowing down. Russia is reconstituting its forces with Chinese technology and producing more weapons faster than we thought. In terms of ammunition, Russia produces in 3 months what the whole of NATO produces in a year.
Well, the whole thrust of this speech was the need for a credible deterrent. In Mark Rutte's words, we can't dream away the danger.
Together, we will secure peace through strength. Together, we will make our alliance stronger, fairer and more lethal. And together, we will build a better NATO.
Well, I've been chatting to Ed Arnold, a senior research fellow at the defence think tank Rutte and a former infantry officer, to get his views on the Secretary-General's predictions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. He's a politician, and actually he's a politician who was criticised for when he was the Prime Minister of a European country for not doing enough on defence. And actually he's gone through quite a Damascene conversion because he is not now beholden to a national electorate. And actually, I think he's now very much more impressive than he was, particularly on this issue. And you could tell that that is his message. You know, he's in the UK for this speech, but he's going around a number of capitals ahead of the NATO summit to sort of bring up this sense of urgency to say this is really important. If we don't take these actions now, then in the future, we are going to be in a really bad place.
I've seen you writing. You're a bit of a Mark Rutte convert in terms of he's kind of grown into the role.
Yeah, and I think sort of where his role is, I mean, it's changed from the previous Secretary General, who was very, very well known for being very calm, making sure that you sort of could bring all allies together, you know, go at the same pace. And I think it's just a realization that NATO now doesn't have that luxury. So he's making the Secretary General position his own. And actually, he's sort of harnessing some of those members, you know, and if you look at current sort of defense spending estimates by a variety of countries, mainly on the northern and eastern flanks, that they're not waiting for a new defense investment pledge from NATO at the Hague summit to go to what is trailed as sort of the 3.5 plus 1.5. They're just going, they're moving. And quite frankly, you know, those nations that aren't meeting that challenge, I mean, they're going to be sort of politely bullied into going, because you can't then say, well, we're not going to go through this modernization, transformation, etc., just because sort of two nations who don't currently border Russia say so. And I think that's actually my big takeaway from the speech when he said there's no West or East, there's only NATO. And that is really important, because quite often the national debates are, well, you're not a frontline state. Well, if you believe in Article 5 and the political declaration to defend every inch of NATO territory, then everyone is a frontline state.
I mean, on that point, he talked about the advance in Russian missile technology and this hypersonics. You know, he was mentioning about European capitals being just within minutes of each other, and that we need to increase NATO's air defense capabilities by 400%. I mean, how ready are we for that missile capability that Russia now possesses?
Well, at the moment, I mean, there are certainly gaps, and the issue is it's integrated air and missile defense just because of the nature of the threats that the Russians can have, from sort of large intercontinental ballistic missiles all the way down to sort of Shahed style drones. But the issue for NATO is it was an area that was deprioritized after the end of the Cold War. And then sort of since the end of the Cold War, the whole point of air defense was to protect your forces in the field. So air defense around Afghanistan to protect your force over there, not your citizens and your infrastructure back home. So this has got much more complicated. And I think also from a NATO planning perspective, you look at the daily attacks on Ukrainian civilian and critical national infrastructure. And that sort of shows you that if you don't have enough air defense to protect your own population. And I think this is why also in terms of the messaging, because he was obviously talking to the British people as well, and other NATO members, he's effectively saying, your tax dollars are going to go to things that you may at some point see on the top of your building in terms of providing air defense in one of the major cities. So again, it starts to bring it's far more real now in terms of those discussions. Again, long range strike, as we've seen with Ukrainians recently, if you can strike the Russian bombers first, well, then they can't attack your cities. So all of these capabilities he's talking about are things that really, I think the population can really get on board with.
We were talking about some, some of the concrete stuff he came out with. He listed I'll read these, the number of tanks. He was saying, I think Russia's building 1,500 tanks a year, 3,000 IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, and 200 Iskander ballistic missiles. Obviously, at the moment, from the Q&A afterwards, they're being largely swallowed up by the war in Ukraine. But that may well come a point where they do start to restock those shelves quite quickly. How deep of reserves do we need to try and compete with that?
I mean, a significant increase in almost everything that NATO has in its stockpiles. And I think the issue is sort of the cupboards are now quite bare because of what we've supplied to Ukraine and committed to supply to Ukraine for a number of years. And this is about not just sort of refilling that cupboard, it's about building other cupboards to put more equipment on, and really to be able to get the overmatch on Russia in the future, which is effectively what they're talking about in terms of deterrence by denial. So making the costs just so much on Russia that they wouldn't attempt an operation. I think that's a really important step, but it also shows that this is quite complex. It's not just about saying, well, we need X amount of infantry fighting vehicles, tankers as well. I mean, supply chain issues, just general production issues are the problem. And there's still some people in Europe to say, well, actually, this might not be necessary in the future. But I think the worrying thing for NATO, which again the Secretary General alluded to this week, is he says, well, NATO needs to be ready by 2030. I mean, that is predicated on the fact that the war in Ukraine doesn't end, but sort of goes into its next phase and allows Russia to recapitalize.
So that could be a frozen front line, effectively, and that they would just be able to, if they produce at this rate.
So fighting at sort of a less intensity than they are now. So, I mean, all of these assessments that you're getting at the moment, I mean, effectively they're saying, well, at that point, you start the stopwatch on potential Russian recapitalization.
And you mentioned he was talking to the British people. He mentioned Churchill quite a few times in this speech. He even mentioned Harold Wilson and that kind of famous white heat speech that he gave talking about technology. And he's going to push this for this 5%, as you mentioned earlier, of GDP at the summit later this month. I mean, how key is that going to be that they agree to it? And how is the UK going to agree to that after we've just had SDR and the idea we're going to reach 2.5%?
Yeah, and I think those references to sort of Second World War politicians may change also when he goes to deliver probably a similar speech in Canada, next week. But I think, again, this is really about trying to make that connection with not just NATO governments, although that is pretty important, but also the electorate, because it also helps our government out in terms of making that assessment. I thought it was very interesting in the Strategic Defence Review that actually the government said, well, we need to get ready for war, but they then didn't provide an assessment of when the UK intelligence community assesses that might be. But they did talk about a NATO first strategy in terms of thinking, acting and planning. So therefore, if you're going to take a NATO first strategy, well, NATO has just set it 2030. The UK needs to be ready for 2030. And that's very important, not just in terms of combat capability, but everything that was in the SDR about national resilience and national preparedness, which was actually probably the more radical part of the document.
So you're an ex-infantry officer, you know this stuff. What does war readiness actually look like tactically, on the ground? What are our forces going to look like in 2030, or what should they look like in 2030 to be ready for that?
Well, I mean, it's going to constantly evolve. I think the first thing is just numbers, and not in terms of just your deployed force, but reserves and the ability to draw on those reserves very, very quickly. You know, as an ex-infantry officer, I am a member of the Strategic Reserve, so I read those parts of the Strategic Defence Review very interestingly, and sort of hope that I actually start to see a change. That so when I get my annual reporting letter from the MOD, that it asks some more questions about just where I live. You know, what is your current fitness state? Do you have any sort of medical issues that would preclude you from going back into uniform, things like that? So I think that's what the SDR was talking about, and that's sort of what it needs to be. But also I think there's an element here about watching how the Russians adapt to the war in Ukraine, because the Russian military that may go up against NATO, say in 2030, will be very different to the one now, and also making sure that that tactical adaptation and innovation cycle is harnessed within NATO militaries, which historically we haven't been good at. And if you just take drones as an example, with the tactical adaptation cycles on the ground of sort of 6 to 8 weeks now, you don't want to be designing things in 2025 that will be ready in 2030, because by the time they are delivered in 2030, they'll likely already be out of date. So also this, takes a bit of risk and a little bit of a leap of faith in some areas as well.
Now, staying with Russia, Ukraine is suffering its most intense aerial bombardment of the war. On Monday, Kyiv was targeted with 479 drones. At the same time, we've seen Ukraine launch several astonishing drone attacks of its own. The most spectacular, of course, Op Spiderweb, where they smuggled drones in the back of lorries into Russia and hit 4 air bases simultaneously, destroying or disabling around 40 long-range bombers. This week, we've also seen the Ukrainians flying drones 800 miles inside Russia to strike an electronics factory that makes navigation systems for Russian drones like the Shahed and missiles like the Iskander. Well, Dr. Ulrike Franke is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and has written extensively about this drones arms race we're seeing in Ukraine.
I think the main reason why we're seeing nights where you have 200, 300, 400 drones and missiles being sent towards Ukraine is that the Ukrainians have gotten really good at counter-drone measures, right? Both electronic and kinetic, so shooting them down or jamming them. And so when Russia only sends a dozen or, say 100 drone into Ukraine, there's a high chance that they will be shot down. And at times Ukraine had, interception rates of 80, 90, 95%. But if Russia is sending 400, as we just saw, drones or missiles into Ukraine, this becomes much harder for Ukraine to intercept. So I think that's a part of the explanation, kind of a tactic by the Russians to just overwhelm the Ukrainian air defenses so that they can't intercept the drones anymore, and they strike civilian targets. So that's number one. And number two, I think it's just also Russia continuing this war with every mean that they have. We also see at the front line more action, and so I think this is just part of the overall effort by Russia to continue this war, really show that they're nowhere near willing to negotiate any kind of peace deal, and continue that.
Drones are now ubiquitous in this war on the battlefield. We were seeing fiber optic drones. There's been reports of the Russians putting, thermobaric warheads on the Garand drone, which is their kind of version of the Shahed. Far more sophisticated counter jamming systems. Sorry, but I've read interestingly that you think Western militaries need to be a bit cautious about drawing too many kind of immediate conclusions about Ukraine. That other wars, perhaps they will fight in the future, might not be like this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why this is so hard, right, to think about it. And this is why I wouldn't want to be the person in the MOD that has to kind of decide which systems to order now and what to do now. So first of all, yes, I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is unprecedented. I always shied away from calling this the kind of the a drone war or the first drone war, because drones have been around for so long. There were drones in the Vietnam War, in Kosovo, everywhere. We did have a war with drones on both sides in between Azerbaijan and Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. So, this isn't exactly new, but the number of drones and the level of innovation we're seeing in Ukraine is really unprecedented. So we're talking millions of drones. That's nothing that we could have imagined a few years ago. And we're talking about innovation. You mentioned the kind of drones that are tethered and basically have, like 20 kilometers or so of a fiber optic cable that they just carry with them so that they can't be intercepted. We have drone motherships. We have innovation really in a way that is really impressive. But what lessons should we be drawing from this right now? Well, we already see, this war is now 3.5 years ongoing, and we already see that if we had drawn some immediate lessons, say in the first year of the war, had said, okay, DJI drones, so kind of Chinese civilian drones, that's the way of warfare, and we now need to acquire 10,000 or 100,000 of them. Had we done that, they would be sitting in our arsenals and would be somewhat useless. I mean, not totally, but pretty much, because countermeasures have been developed against them and the innovation has moved on, right? And now we're talking about FPV, first-person view drones, or other systems. And so I think the way we need to think about this now is we shouldn't be concentrating so much on specific systems. We shouldn't be saying like, okay, well, the future of drone warfare is the first-person view drone, is the drone mothership, is the tethered drone with fiber optic cable. That's all part of the innovation cycle, and it could already be made obsolete or largely obsolete tomorrow. I think what we need is an acquisition process that allows for a lot of speed and a lot of innovation be built in, and a lot of modularity, meaning that you produce something, you have a little bit of a stock, but you are able to kind of change the production line if need be. You are able to produce something else if need be. You need a good back and forth between the MOD, the armed forces, the state, and the industry. And to some extent here, we can also learn from the Ukrainians because they're quite good at this exchange. But that's really the big challenge. And I kind of half jokingly say we need a new military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex, of course, in the US in the past being something that was criticized. And I'm not saying we need to replicate that exactly, but I think we need a pretty trusting relationship between, the armed forces, MOD, and the industry that allows you to kind of build up production capabilities more than do contracts now over 100,000 drones of this type. Because again, there's a good chance that you put 100,000 drones of this type in your arsenal and then someone invents a countermeasure and you're stuck with a system that you can't really use any longer.
I mean, how do you inject that speed into the procurement process? I mean, I remember being at DSCI, only a few years ago, and we were all kind of starstruck by one little Ukrainian company that had a drone that could drop a grenade. Mm-hmm. We thought this was the most innovative thing we'd ever seen, and now look where we are. How do you inject that speed into these very slow procurement processes, culturally anyway?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is the big challenge, and I don't have the perfect answer to this. This is really a fight against bureaucracy, right? And I mean, honestly, one of the answers on how to do that is just a realization that the urgency is needed. And there's a reason why Ukraine is pretty good at this, is because they have to. They don't have the time to wait, 2, 3, 5, 10 years for acquisition, procurement, contracts, all of this. They need to do this now because otherwise they won't survive. And of course, that's not, I'm not saying that what they're doing is perfect. And in fact, there are already reports about fraud and things like that, which is normal, but they're pretty good in the sense that, they do get the results. So I think it's a realization that this is needed, that we do need to cut through some red tape, to use a little bit of, Brexit vocabulary. I think in this case, it's actually warranted. But this is really hard, and all countries struggle with this. And honestly, I have the same discussions in Germany that I have in the US. Like, they're all realizing that this acquisition process doesn't work like it should, or isn't really doing what it should be doing. I think we need to change in a way the contracts we're doing. Again, it's less about buy 100,000 of X and more put in the production capabilities to scale up if needed and things like that. But this is going to be hard, and there's a learning process. And in the end, it comes down to political will, the willingness for risk taking. And we need to be honest here as well and say, if there's a level of risk taking, that also means that some of the risks won't pan out. Like, some of the risks you're taking won't work in your favor, and you may be losing money on some issues. That's always hard to explain to the taxpayer. But I think that's where we need to be headed. But this is definitely difficult for bureaucrats and politicians that need to be accountable to taxpayers.
And what about China's role in all this? That's the key one, because all these components, lots of them anyway, are coming from China. How difficult will it be to scale domestic production without using those parts?
Yeah, that's such an important point. So I think here this is more about realizing the fact that the large majority of drones and drone parts are from China. I mean, at one point, when we were talking more like, a year ago or so about civilian drones being used in Ukraine, 99.9% of civilian drones are basically made in China, right? So all of them were made in China. Now we're much more talking about Ukrainian companies or other companies producing drones themselves that they have developed, but the parts still come primarily from China. And this is, I think you can see this especially with regard to drones, but this is true for so many other things. Like China is the manufacturing house of the world, and pretty much everything is produced there. And of course, that introduces a level of vulnerability and dependency that is really problematic, because imagine, China in this conflict is already not exactly neutral and supporting Russia, but it is still delivering one way or another systems to Ukraine. But imagine a future war in which China may not be an indirect supporter, but a direct supporter of the other side. They could basically cut off production and delivery of these parts. And so I think what needs to happen is that we in the West need to be able to produce much more of these systems by ourselves. This is possible, quite honestly. I like to joke, this isn't rocket science, because we can do this. And there are an increasing number of companies in the West that are producing their own systems, either in the West or, in other places, by the way, in Taiwan, for example. So I think we need to be aware of this dependency and then fight against it. In most cases, this is more a money issue than anything else. We can do this. It's just that generally it's probably going to be more expensive to produce things in, say, the UK than in China. But in order to kind of de-risk the situation here, I think this is what is needed. And then, of course, it also helps the local economy and all of that. So you do get some positive benefits, economically speaking, as well. But it probably will just be more expensive, which is why, it's kind of good news, if you want to phrase it like that defense budgets are increasing all over NATO countries, because then you can produce stuff at home more easily. But yeah, this is also a challenge, because you need to put in place the production lines and all of that. But honestly, this can be done. It's just that we need to realize that this really is needed and that there is this dependency before it is too late. Because scaling up production massively, if you're find yourself in a conflict where China may just cut us off, that's going to be much harder. So we need to do it now.
And just the point you made earlier on, I guess the danger for Western militaries, as you said, is buying the wrong kit. They're going to buy produce drones that will be technologically out of date by the time they're actually needed in an actual war. And off the back of the SDR announcements, that's going to be a real key decision. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting, because we still look at Ukraine, and I get asked this a lot, like, is Ukraine the future of warfare? And we need to realize that Ukraine, in a way, is already the last war, right? We already say the military is always preparing for the last war. Well, Ukraine is already the last war for us. So we can't just take Ukraine and say, oh, this is the future of warfare. So we're going to, draw X and Y lessons, and we're going to do that and that. We need to think further and think, okay, so what lessons or what things that are happening in Ukraine may be specific to this specific conflict, because of the geography, topography, because of who is fighting whom, because of what systems are available, and will this translate into the conflicts we are thinking about fighting, and we may find ourselves. And this is not going to be perfect. We will get things wrong. The important thing is just to not get too much wrong, and be as flexible as possible. But yeah, no one pretends that this is easy. And again, we will get things wrong, and we need to be kind of okay with this, and not just blame people if they do make wrong decisions on this, because we don't have perfect, hindsight is 20/20, but foresight isn't.
This week we also saw the Ukrainians strike an electronics factory 800 miles inside Russia, one of the longest strikes they've ever carried out, I think. How impressive a feat was that?
Honestly, I've been impressed with the Ukrainians ever since the war started. They've been really good, actually, at striking in Russian territory more or less since the beginning. I remember December 2022, where they reworked an old Soviet drone and kind of sent it to, I think it was Engels Air Base at the time, so already quite inside Russian territory. So they've been doing this, ever since the beginning of the war, and they keep doing this. So yes, this for me is kind of in line with this overall development. They have the urgency and the need to do this, but their ability to innovate and to also think things in a new way. I mean, Operation Spiderweb is less about the kind of use of technology and more about the kind of novel use of it and the way to come up with innovative uses. So that's what the Ukrainians have been incredibly good at, and what has also helped them to stay in this fight.
Well, let's go back to the warnings from Mark Rutte. One of them was that China's growing military power, including its maritime forces, means NATO needs to develop more Indo-Pacific partnerships to meet the challenge posed by Beijing. China already has the world's largest navy with around 400 ships, and that figure is expected to grow to 435 vessels by 2030. That's getting on for double the size of the US fleet. Well, Mark Rutte's warning, of course, comes as the Royal Navy's Carrier Strike Group continues its journey eastwards toward the Indo-Pacific. The 8th-month deployment, also known as Operation HIMARS, will involve at various points around 4,500 British military personnel. That includes nearly 600 from the RAF, 900 soldiers, alongside 2,500 Royal Navy sailors and Royal Marines. Well, Commodore Steve Prest was the commander weapon engineer on Britain's other carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth. He was also part of the top-level team that brought the QE out of build and into sea trials.
Yeah, so they're currently transiting the Indian Ocean and heading across into the Asia-Pacific region. But the transit of the Red Sea itself was a pretty big deal, having done this extremely large NATO strike exercise in the Mediterranean, which went extremely well, was very successful, and really demonstrated the capability and contribution of the carrier strike group to NATO. They transited the Suez Canal and down through the Red Sea, which and it will not escape the attention of the Forces News and Sitrep listeners, that this has been a pretty intense area of activity and substantial threat in recent months. But due to really good planning, very good risk management, and some excellent support from into HIMARS from other elements of, for example, the Royal Air Force and coalition allies, that all passed without incident. They got through safely into the Indian Ocean and have just had a good run ashore, letting their hair down a bit in Dhaka, in Oman.
So we've been talking about earlier Mark Rutte's speech this week about the bigger strategic picture, if you like, and this warning about the rapid growth of China's navy. How does this CSG 25 fit into that wider strategic picture?
Well, and it's a big landscape, isn't it, to look across. The Chinese Navy, People's Liberation Army Navy, hasn't got to be the biggest in the world overnight. This is part of decades-long strategic investment. Firstly, in the industrial capacity and the technology, and then, of course, now they're churning out ships at a pretty high rate. And I think there are lessons in this from us. Strategic Defence Review has recently come out and talked of shipbuilding. And we need to have that same sort of 30-year timeline that the previous national shipbuilding strategy envisaged, so that we can make sure we've got the ship for the future. But more back to the here and now, of course, there's a really interesting relationship with China. It's seen in the region as threatening, it's flexing its muscles, as assertive and dominant. And we need to reassure our allies in the area that we're part of the effort to make sure that they're looked after and that we live up to our expectations. But of course, there's also an economic partnership with China, where we're codependents as part of this globalized economy. So it's a very complex relationship. But one of the things we need to be able to do is demonstrate presence, demonstrate commitment to the region, and demonstrate the fact that we've got something to bring to the party. Should there be any kind of confrontation with China, of course the United Kingdom would not be engaging in that on its own. But we might need at some stage to support our friends and allies in the region, including, of course, the United States of America.
So you mentioned presence. I mean, we're entering this Indo-Pacific phase of this deployment where things could obviously get quite interesting diplomatically. What's the plan, do you think, for when it approaches this sensitive area around China, the Taiwan Strait? I mean, Mike Clark, our esteemed Sitrep colleague, has sort of wagered that some elements of CSG might enter the South China Sea, go through the South China Sea, but none of them will go through the Taiwan Strait. What are your thoughts on that?
Of course, these are international waters. And so any of these ships, or all of them, have got every right to go through under international maritime law. So doing so might be interpreted by the Chinese as trying to send a message or trying to encroach on their territory. But we would have every right to go through these international waters. And actually, one of the important things is to assert that right in what's known as freedom of navigation operations, where warships do transit to make the point that they can and they're allowed to. Now, that might upset the Chinese, but they've got no more right to say the South China Sea is theirs and no one else is allowed into it than we would have to say prevent a Chinese ship from transiting through the Dover Straits. It's in our backyard. We would keep a very close eye on them. We would make sure they knew we were keeping a very close eye on them. But nonetheless, they have every right to make that innocent passage. And so I would certainly anticipate, but I don't know, because clearly the specific operation plans are kept on close hold for very good reasons. I would anticipate at least some elements of the carrier strike group transiting through those sorts of waters. Where precisely they'll go and why, and of course what diplomatic conversations will happen in the back channels in order to make sure that the messaging of the actions are not misunderstood or misinterpreted. I'm not party to, and I don't think we would. But it'll be really interesting to see, firstly, what happens, and then what the response is and how the narrative around it plays out.
I'll come back to that. I was going to ask you about that, and I'll ask you about that in a second. But I mean, to your point, the flip side, obviously, of not going through is the message it sends if we don't. About this global Britain, global presence, etc., and freedom of navigation, as you mentioned. So, I mean, HMS Richmond, I think, went through in 2021, so it has been done before. So, I guess there is a message to be sent by the UK actually, transiting through there.
Yes, well, I think so, but I don't think the message is and should not be interpreted as, we're coming here to flex our muscles and sort of face down the Chinese Navy, because even with a very potent carrier strike group in that part of the world, that would be an absurd thing to try and do. But I think one can say, look, we've got established norms and customs as an international maritime law here, and actually we've got every right to do this. And so we want to exercise our lawful rights to make a peaceful transit through these waters in order to get where we're going. Now, there are certain things that come along with that. But, the point is these are international waters. They're outside the 12-mile limit. I don't foresee any circumstances in which Royal Navy vessels would encroach into Chinese territorial waters where it would be part of an international strait where one's passing through on a right of instant passage. But in international waters, we should be making the point to say, hey, look, we're not coming to pose a threat to you. We're coming through, going about our legitimate business, and we've got every right to do so.
So if they did go through, what might be, from a military and naval point of view, what might be the Chinese response in terms of putting ships into that area, jets, etc.? What could you possibly expect?
Well, I suspect that the Chinese would want to make it uncomfortable for us, because let's be clear. They don't accept that these are international waters in that sort of sense that I've described. They think of it as their backyard and that they should really have exclusive use and control over, which of course is the whole point of exerting one's rights to the contrary. So I would expect them to make it uncomfortable. What does that look like? Well, it might be that they decide to do exercises. They'll certainly keep a close eye on. They'll probably fly their aircraft and drive their ships around closer than is comfortable. And that will elicit some interaction between the ships, which will, be akin to probing and testing our response. How angsty do we get? Actually, what I expect in the event is for most of that to be a little bit tense, but actually polite, professional, and courteous as it goes through, certainly from the CSG. And only if it gets to a point where they do something reckless in terms of safety of navigation or safety in the air, would I anticipate there to be any more problem with that. But of course, the command teams on board the ships and in the carrier strike group will have been talking to allies in the region. They'll have done their preparation. They'll have rehearsed these sorts of scenarios as part of their training, and they will understand, how they would react in different circumstances. So they won't be going into it making up as they go along. Of course, should something difficult happen, then it will be a novel situation. But they'll have worked through those contingencies to have an understanding of how they would respond. But let's be clear, the carrier strike group's position will be to de-escalate. There'll be no intent to try and pick a fight. All they wish to do is see through the international waters peacefully going about their lawful business.
Just out of interest, have you personally had any interaction with the Chinese Navy like that? And just interested how it works in terms of you talking to them on the radio and, what sort of words might be issued to you?
Well, it was a long time ago since I was out in that part of the world. I was, and in fact, I was on a French ship at the time, and we made a visit into Shanghai. So we were kind of there by invitation. And of course, the world of the early 2000s was a very different geopolitical place. And indeed, China was a very different place. So I've got no direct experience of interacting with Chinese forces in that region. But what I can tell you is from other operations I've been on in other parts of the world, which are or have been somewhat contested, what tends to happen is aeroplanes will come out or ships will come out and they will fly or sail in profiles which might look a little bit threatening, just to test your responses. And how hard they push will depend upon what orders they've been given and what they're trying to achieve through those interactions. There's no doubt in my view that if CFG goes through those waters, the Chinese will want to make some sort of point that they disapprove of this and that they're geared up and keyed up militarily to defend their sovereignty. And but actually, I think it'd be very surprising if there was any sort of attack or offensive military action. So I'd expect the response from the Chinese to be firm. It might even appear to be aggressive, but it'll be a dog that barks, not one that bites, in my view.
Just finally, you mentioned alliances. There's obviously Talisman Sabre, beginning of July, the big exercise. I think 30,000 personnel involved in that. Obviously, the Brits with the Americans and the Australians. What's that going to involve, and what's that going to give the CSG?
Well, it'll give the CFG a really good experience of working with our allies. And of course, both the Australians and the Americans operate varying types of the F-35. So it'll give our F-35s operating from the carrier strike group the chance to operate in a broader coalition under those exercise conditions. It'll give those personnel that go ashore as part of that exercise a real experience of operating in that part of Australia, which is a very peculiar territory. It's proper Crocodile Dundee country. I was there a few years ago visiting a chum of mine in the Australian Army who's based in Darwin, and it's an extraordinary part of the world. And hopefully it'll give our sailors the opportunity for a real cultural visit into the Northern Territory as well, which I would highly recommend for anyone who gets the chance. But yeah, what it's about is it's about getting used to working in those sorts of environments, used to working with both sorts of people. They're used to delivering the sorts of capabilities that the carrier strike group can deliver in that part of the world, extended lines of communication, extended logistic support, and then being able to bring to bear all of that capability that was honed and trained in the Mediterranean down and delivered as a capability on the far side of the world. And that in itself will be a really powerful demonstration. There'll be lots of things that will be learned, lots of lessons identified and things to work on, no doubt. These things are never perfect, but actually it's a magnificent opportunity to work with our really close allies in that part of the world to show and learn how we can really work in concert should it be required.
Steve, great to talk to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Simon.
Thanks to all our guests. That's all for now. Professor Michael Clark and Kate Jabot will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. Until then, you can always catch up with past programs you might have missed online at bfbs.com/sitrep, the BFBS Forces News YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from me, Simon Newton, thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.